It's here, President Trump's not-so-ambitious plan to deal with climate change. So now what? This is Trump on Earth. I'm Reed Frazier. It feels like a million years ago, but once upon a time, the Obama administration created a sweeping rule to curb carbon emissions from the power sector. The Clean Power Plan would have dealt a big blow to coal-fired power plants around the country. But upon taking office, President Trump undid that plan. Now his EPA chief, Andrew Wheeler, has offered a replacement, the Affordable Clean Energy, or ACE rule. But what is in the rule may not be nearly as important as what the courts decide to do with it. We'll hear more about that when Trump on Earth continues.
Hi, I'm Nate Cubis.
And I'm Reggie Cubis.
We're the sons of Trump on Earth producer Andy Cubis.
She works behind the scenes.
We think you should support this podcast on how do you say this word? Patreon. Because the environment matters for us kids.
Go to patreon.com/TrumpOnEarth to learn more.
You can pledge as little as $1 a month.
We can even afford that with our measly allowance, right, Nate?
Right. Thank you.
Thank you for your time and for your attention, and thank you for joining us on this important day.
EPA Administrator Andrew Wheeler recently rolled out the Affordable Clean Energy, or ACE rule.
Our ACE rule will incentivize new technologies that will ensure coal plants can be part of a cleaner future. As we stand here today, the United States is the #1 energy producer in the world. At the same time, we've reduced our carbon emissions and improved air quality and public health. The ACE rule will continue our nation's progress. Thank you.
The new plan throws out many of the initiatives outlined by its predecessor, the Clean Power Plan. Instead of encouraging states to get rid of coal in favor of cleaner sources, it'll mandate modest improvements in efficiency at coal-fired power plants. Critics say it basically does nothing to prevent climate change at a time when global warming is turning into an existential crisis. The plan will be challenged in court, and our guest today says we should pay attention to that court fight. I'm joined by Jody Freeman. She's professor at Harvard Law School and founder of the school's Environmental and Energy Law program. She served in the Obama White House as counselor for energy and climate change. Jody Freeman, welcome to Trump on Earth.
Thanks for having me.
So we should give some background to the latest release of the ACE rule, the Affordable Clean Energy rule. It's aimed at the electric sector, the second largest source of greenhouse gases in the country. In 2015, the Obama administration unveiled a rule that would cut emissions from that sector. That was called the Clean Power Plan. What was that plan, and what is this ACE rule that's replacing it?
So to put this in perspective, we just have to remember what the Obama administration tried to do on climate policy.
And today we're here to announce America's Clean Power Plan, a plan 2 years in the making, and the single most important step America has ever taken in the fight against global climate change.
And the policy had two main pillars. One was to try to increase fuel efficiency for cars and trucks, and that's because transportation is a big share of the greenhouse gas emissions in the U.S. economy. But the other big share is from the electric power sector. And so the Obama administration put in place what you refer to as the Clean Power Plan. And that was really a set of standards to try to limit carbon pollution coming from the oldest and dirtiest power plants in the country, which are the coal and natural gas-fired plants that have been around for many, many years. And the Obama standards were ambitious.
But I am here to say that if we want to protect our economy and our security and our children's health, we're going to have to do more. The science tells us we have to do more.
They sought to reduce the pollution coming from the power sector over time. The projection was that they would have improved on greenhouse gas emissions by reducing them up to almost 20% below what would have happened anyway in the economy by 2030.
Right now, our power plants are the source of about a third of America's carbon pollution. That's more pollution than our cars, our airplanes, and our homes generate combined. That pollution contributes to climate change, which degrades the air our kids breathe. But there have never been federal limits on the amount of carbon that power plants can dump into the air. Think about that. We limit the amount of toxic chemicals like mercury and sulfur and arsenic in our air or our water, and we're better off for it. But existing power plants can still dump unlimited amounts of harmful carbon pollution into the air. For the sake of our kids and the health and safety of all Americans, that has to change. For the sake of the planet, that has to change.
By comparison, what the Trump plan would do is reduce emissions from the electric power sector by less than 1% by 2030. So you can see just with that comparison that the Trump plan is actually designed to do almost nothing to deal with carbon pollution from the electric power sector.
Our ACE rule will incentivize new technologies that will ensure coal plants can be part of a cleaner future. As we stand here today, the United States is the #1 energy producer in the world. At the same time, we've reduced our carbon emissions and improved air quality and public health. The ACE rule will continue our nation's progress.
And the only other thing to add by way of giving context is the two plans are really using the same law. They're both using the Clean Air Act as the authority that the EPA has to put these standards in place. They just have very different approaches to how they would use the Clean Air Act. The Obama administration saw that they had more flexibility to be more ambitious, and the Trump administration's view is they have absolutely no flexibility and can't do any better.
Unlike the CPP, the ACE rule adheres to the four corners of the Clean Air Act. EPA sets the best system of emission reductions, and then states set the standards of performance. This is how the Clean Air Act says the process should work.
So there's this term of art being used to describe the ACE rule, and that is that it's within the four corners of the Clean Air Act. Can you kind of describe the sort of main difference in the sort of legal strategy used in the Clean Power Plan versus this new ACE rule?
Yes, so this gets very nerdy and technical, but it actually can be boiled down to something fairly simple. The Clean Air Act says that for these power plants, the administration shall set standards that are, quote, the best system of emission reduction. That's the legal language. What's the best system of emission reduction? And that's the job the EPA has, is to figure out what that best system is and then set standards. So the Obama folks said, well, the best system of emission reduction, if you look at the electricity grid, is really a question about what can you do with the entire integrated grid, which operates like a giant machine. And what I mean is that all the power plants are linked together. You can dial up wind and solar power at certain times of day. You can dial down coal-fired and natural gas-fired power, etc. So the Obama team looked at the entire grid and said, using all the tools available on this interconnected machine, how can we reduce greenhouse gas emissions? How can we do that by improving the use of efficiency? So we want the power plants to get more efficient, but we also expect to substitute in more solar power, more wind power, that is more renewables for coal and for natural gas. And we want to also substitute in more natural gas for coal because it's cleaner than coal. So what I'm describing is an approach in which they thought that setting the best system of emission reduction enabled them to look at the entire system. What the Trump administration does is quite different. They say, oh, no. The best system of emission reduction refers only to what you can do to cut your pollution at the site of the facility. You can't look at the grid as an interconnected machine. That's not what best system means. And so that leaves us looking at these plants and asking, how can they, in modest ways, become a little more efficient? And so their approach, they're quite narrow. You might think of it as a very skinny or a kind of very meek approach, is to say, we're only going to look at what the units can do themselves. We're not going to treat them as what they are in reality, which is an interconnected system. So to really understand the difference here, you have to see what each of these strategies can accomplish. Because the Obama strategy, to set standards looking across the grid allows you to substitute in natural gas for coal and renewables for coal and natural gas. And if you do that over time, what you can show is that the greenhouse gas emissions from the power sector go down significantly. But if you can't deploy more renewables, and if you can't substitute in natural gas for coal, you really can't achieve very much at all. You're left with these very modest efficiency upgrades at the units themselves on the sites of the power plants. So you really can't get very far with that policy.
Yeah, and I guess that goes to sort of like the core of the Clean Air Act, which is basically a lot of it has been to get polluting companies to just use the best gadget out there that emits the least. Am I right about that?
Yeah, it depends on the section of the law because the words really matter. But Congress sometimes refers to the best technology. And if you're thinking about that, you might think about equipment. You know, what kind of scrubber can you put on your facility that will reduce the pollution that comes out of the smokestack? But you'll notice this language has best system. And, the EPA under Obama thought the best system when you're looking at carbon pollution, which doesn't have a kind of equipment fix yet for it, right? When you're looking at carbon pollution and you're looking at the interconnected grid, it makes sense to think of a system more broadly. This is really, a question of interpretation. And, reasonable people can disagree about what they think those words mean. And inevitably, this debate, I think, will wind up in the courts and may even go all the way to the Supreme Court. The Obama plan was challenged, and it did get to the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, which is really sort of the court right before you get to the Supreme Court. And they heard the argument in the case. And the D.C. Circuit, I was at oral argument. It was a very long, very interesting day of arguments. The judges on the D.C. Circuit seemed to look like the majority of them were going to come down finding that the Clean Power Plan was actually perfectly legal and that the interpretation was a reasonable one. That's how most of us read the courtroom. But that decision never really got finalized. The Trump administration came in and took office before the court had issued its opinion, and they went and asked them to hold the case in abeyance because they wanted to replace the rule. And so it's taken a couple of years, but that is what the announcement was just recently last week, was that they had finalized this rule. And so their argument now is, the court doesn't need to decide about the Obama plan because it's been rescinded. So now what we're likely to see is a challenge from certain states like California, New York, and many others, and environmental groups and others challenging the new rule that the Trump administration has put out, arguing that it has a variety of legal flaws and hoping that the D.C. Circuit will strike it down.
I want to get to that, the coming legal fight in a minute, but just to sort of explain some of the kind of legal background of this rule, the Trump administration couldn't just sit on its hand and say, no, we're good, we're not going to do any kind of climate plan. Isn't that right?
That's right. So this goes all the way back to a Supreme Court case that became quite famous, which was decided in 2007, called Massachusetts versus EPA.
We'll hear argument first today in 05-1120, Massachusetts versus Environmental Protection Agency.
And in that case, the George W. Bush administration had taken the view that it didn't have the power to regulate carbon dioxide or any other greenhouse gas under the Clean Air Act.
I think, Your Honor, that the key to the agency was that Congress did not give it regulatory authority over this. And I think on the question of whether or not greenhouse gas emissions qualify as
But you can't give me any text in this statute itself. Well, it isn't the phrase air pollution or any other phrase.
The agency
includes them.
The agency pointed to the term air pollution agent in the statute, and it concluded that because global climate change was not air pollution that Congress intended to address.
And that brings us back to acid rain.
And with respect to acid rain, it's a good example.
The Supreme Court in Mass versus EPA rejected that view.
In case 05-1120, Massachusetts versus Environmental Protection Agency, Justice Stevens has the opinion which will be announced by Justice Kennedy.
And said that the word pollutant is defined very broadly in the Clean Air Act, and it includes greenhouse gases.
Now, on the merits, and contrary to EPA's position, we hold that the Clean Air Act's sweeping definition of air pollutant unambiguously covers greenhouse gases. That definition states that an air pollutant is, and then I'll quote from the statute,
so go back and explain why you won't set standards. In that case, it was about setting standards for vehicles, for cars and trucks.
Carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, hydrofluorocarbons are without a doubt physical and chemical substances which are emitted into the ambient air. So the statute is clear. We also reject EPA's alternative.
The Bush administration came to an end. The Obama administration came in and actually went ahead and set the first ever federal standards for greenhouse gases. They actually set those standards for cars and trucks. And that's when I was in the White House and I worked on that policy. So under the law, the Supreme Court has said that EPA has authority, and they've also indicated that the section that the agency is using now to set standards for power plants, that they will have to go ahead and set some standards for power plants because they're causing an endangerment through this pollution. And the EPA has found that pollution causes an endangerment. Greenhouse gases pose a variety of risks. And so they've already kind of flipped the switch. Or you might say pulled the trigger that you need to legally to require them to do something. And the question is, what's that something going to be? And the Obama folks answered that question with a much more ambitious plan, which after all we need if we're really going to get on a pathway to doing something about the greenhouse gas emissions in our economy. Small, trivial improvements are not going to get us where we need to go. But the Trump administration has decided to unravel all of that.
So if you were arguing against the ACE rule before the Supreme Court or one of the appellate courts, what would your argument be?
There are a couple things I expect the challengers to argue. First of all, they're going to pounce on a lot of the assumptions in this rule. There are a lot of very favorable assumptions they make to defend their rule that are quite questionable. They have an analysis that they're using that manages to minimize the benefits of trying to cut carbon pollution while maximizing the costs, which I think folks are going to challenge. I mean, it's very interesting that a rule that purports to be trying to reduce pollution, by their own projection, might increase it. So that's one of the biggest vulnerabilities. They're in the draft rule that came out before this final version. It was even more pronounced than what they've put out now, but they projected that it's possible for these emissions to actually go up, depending on how long plants run. Because if it's, you have to bear with me here, but there's a part of the proposal that would allow coal plants to update or upgrade, allowing them to run longer without putting any pollution controls on. That's another piece of this proposal. And that's kind of a life extension project for coal plants. And if that happens, they might actually be running so much longer that you have a net increase in greenhouse gas emissions. So a policy that says that it's supposed to be reducing pollution actually increases it under certain projections. And I think a court might have a hard time with that and say, how could this be defended as a rational plan? The other argument, though, is going to be about what the law means. You know, does best system of emission reduction mean what the Trump administration says it means or not? And so there will be a very furious fight about how to interpret the act. It is possible, if this were to go all the way to the Supreme Court, we don't know whether it will, but if the court were to take it, it certainly is possible that they could accept the Trump administration's very cramped, very narrow view of their power and say, the only way to read this law is the way they do. And if the court says that, it could create an obstacle for future administrations because it would be locking in an interpretation that is a very minimal, very limited way of viewing the act. But it's also possible the Supreme Court would do something different, because this is an available place to land for the Supreme Court if it were to say, well, your reading is reasonable, but the language is ambiguous. The language isn't clear enough to say yours is the only way to read it. And that would leave room for another administration to come in and go back and re-examine this and take a different approach. So again, it gets pretty technical and pretty nerdy, but the bottom line is it depends how the court sees the law. And we can only know whether it will be a real problem for future administrations after we see the reasoning that the court uses to decide the case.
So it bears noting that right before Justice Antonin Scalia died, the Supreme Court put a halt to the original Clean Power Plan. And I believe that was a 5-4 decision, correct?
Yes.
I guess, for us amateur court watchers out there, the court has only gotten a little bit more conservative in the intervening years with the additions of Justices Kavanaugh and Gorsuch. Does that necessarily mean anything in terms of like how a future Supreme Court might judge this law?
Well, we really don't know that from what you're referring to, because you're talking about the Supreme Court staying the rule, which is just a way of saying they prevented it from going into effect while it was being litigated through the courts. And that was a very unusual step. Normally, the court allows rules from the federal government to go into place and be implemented pending legal challenge. And they either get upheld or they get invalidated. But while you're waiting, the rule is considered active and effective. What the Supreme Court did just before Justice Scalia died, one of the last votes he cast, was to actually stay the Clean Power Plan and wait until it was resolved through the courts. In fact, they said until we decide, the Supreme Court said, until we see it and review it, it won't be legally effective. So that did happen, but it doesn't say anything about what the court would have done on the merits if they were to hear the case themselves. So I think there was still some, lack of clarity really about what the court would ultimately do. And all eyes were on the DC Circuit, the first court that would hear the case. I think you're right to point out that we have two new fairly conservative justices. In particular, Justice Kavanaugh, when he served on the lower court on the DC Circuit, he made clear that he was very critical of and skeptical of agency efforts to do big things, basically. When agencies sought to impose standards or rules or regulations that were far-reaching and ambitious, it would really attract a lot of skepticism from then Judge Kavanaugh, who thought that they should go back to Congress for a more explicit authority. So I think we all expect that Justice Kavanaugh would be quite skeptical of a far-reaching rule. But that doesn't mean that the justices won't find problems with what this EPA has done. Most justices and judges, no matter who nominated and them, no matter what party they were nominated by, they like procedure to be correct. They like arguments to be rational and backed up by facts and evidence. And when there are inconsistencies and big leaps and big assumptions that can't be supported, and there may be some in this rule, they have trouble with it. So notwithstanding the conservative view of some of the justices, I think the question is, will they be open-minded when they look at all of the decisions that the EPA made? And there, I think there's some prospect for striking down the rule.
So walk me through what happens next with this ACE rule. What's the next legal procedure that we should be looking for?
There's a good chance that this won't reach the Supreme Court. Here we are in 2019. The rule has just been finalized. It takes some time for it to be formally published, which means it's not legally effective until it's formally published in a document called the Federal Register. So it's another few weeks typically until that. Then you've got a couple of months in which challengers can file their lawsuits to challenge it. Then you have a time period that has to elapse for all the briefs in the case to be written. The DC Circuit would have to come up with a briefing schedule and, schedule our argument. And I'm saying all these things because these lawsuits take a lot of time. And months and months will go by before we actually get to oral argument. And then after the case is argued, the court, which is a 3-judge panel on the DC Circuit, that's who hears these things, needs time to deliberate. And in a complex case like this, that's going to take some time. And then there might be a dissent, who knows, because in complex cases, often you have maybe 2 judges in the majority and 1 in the dissent. That would be quite typical. And then when you have a case with a dissent, it takes them even longer to draft the opinions. So what I'm trying to say is it looks pretty tough on this calendar to imagine even the DC Circuit deciding this challenge before the 2020 presidential election. And so if that's true, you may not get a decision until you have a new president or a second Trump administration. And if it's a new president, I can imagine, if it's a Democrat, I can imagine that they would go back into court and say just what the Trump folks said 4 years before, which is, please don't decide this case. Please hold it in abeyance, because we too are going to go back and rescind and replace this rule. So you could imagine getting into a new presidential administration and having no court ever having ruled on either the Obama plan to reduce CO2 from the power sector or the Trump administration's effort to actually do very little to reduce that pollution. You might end up with no decision at all. So that's entirely possible.
Wow. That's a little...
It's pretty interesting, right? And you know, what this all points to is the fact that we are working here with a statute, the Clean Air Act, which is a very powerful law drafted to give the agency flexibility. But it is a law that dates to 1970. And it's not the perfect instrument for dealing with climate change from all of the sectors of the U.S. economy. And everybody who's worked with it knows that. And President Obama knew that and said that publicly. And so did his EPA administrators. What everybody prefers is that the one player that's missing in action get in the game. And that is the U.S. Congress. So what you're seeing is a pendulum shifting back and forth from administration to administration as the Environmental Protection Agency goes to look at its authorities under the Clean Air Act. And one administration reads the act one way and another administration reads the act another way. And that's the kind of way this is playing out because Congress has not drafted a law to address climate change. So I think what all this points to is it's long past time for the U.S. Congress to do something about this problem and pass a new statute. And it will eliminate all this back and forth and moving through the courts. Right now, the institutions making climate policy at the federal level in the United States are whatever president wins the election in partnership with the courts. That's the dynamic. And the Congress is nowhere to be seen.
So the ACE rule will actually get very close to what the Clean Power Plan's goals were without many of the interventions that the Clean Power Plan envisioned. What's the argument against the ACE rule if it looks like the market is already kind of lowering carbon emissions in the power sector?
You hear a lot of people say, and the Trump administration has embraced this, defending this new rule, that the market's going to take care of this anyway.
From 2005 to 2017, total U.S. energy-related CO2 emissions fell by 14%. We owe much of this progress to the genius of the private sector and the free markets, not the heavy hand of government. That is a testament.
And what they mean
to the
is
ingenuity and
natural
achievement
gas
of many of
is
the folks in
replacing
this room
coal
today.
because natural gas is cheaper. And so the electricity sector is cleaning up because of market forces, because we have such abundant, cheap natural gas. And the problem with that claim is that while it's true that natural gas is helping to clean up the electricity sector, and while it's true that coal plants are retiring, it's not enough. The market alone cannot reduce emissions nearly to the point that we need to make progress on climate change. And so if you really put this in perspective, what they're saying is we just want to let the market work. And what the Obama administration was doing was building on the market and saying, yes, it's going in the right direction, but we want to send a signal to the electric power industry that says we're headed even further and we want cuts to be deeper. So when you go to make your investments in the next set of power plants, understand that we'll be headed toward more renewables deployment, more natural gas, less coal, and that market signal would help to drive investments over decades in the electric power sector, and it would produce much, much deeper reductions. So I just wanted to explain that because this idea that the market's working, yes, it's working, but it's not going to solve the problem by itself. It's the market plus some regulation and a market signal to the industry that the Obama administration thought was the best policy.
So the Obama administration's approach, as you outlined, was to sort of guide the market to where it thought it needed to go with respect to lowering carbon emissions.
I would intervene there just to say one thing. I think it was a little different. It was to look at what the market was doing and what technology was already doing. and saying, oh, the grid, we already can do these things on the grid. Grid managers are already substituting in renewables for coal and for gas. This is happening. And so we can see and project over time how much of it is possible without cutting anybody's electricity and without raising costs too high. So that was their approach, to look at the market, look at technology, and project out what was reasonable to expect. And what we've seen is that actually they could have been even more ambitious, because guess what? The market and technology is doing even better than we thought in terms of turning to renewables. So it's funny because the Trump administration's rule is trying to claim that the market's doing plenty, so the government's not necessary. But in fact, what they're really proving is the market's doing so well and technology's doing so well that the Obama administration maybe didn't even go far enough.
Yeah, and so that brings me to the thought of, like, what happens if there's a new president in 2 years, or let's say 2024, Trump, serves out his term. What is the degree of difficulty on climate change has gone up because it will have by then. Are the sort of clean power plan style interventions going to be enough at that point, or what will be necessary?
Yeah, I mean, the way scientific experts talk about climate change is, lost time is very serious, because, had we dealt with this problem 20 years ago by putting in place an agenda that over time would reduce emissions, it would have been less expensive, and we would have had a much better chance at keeping global average temperatures to a place that would be less risky. And so the more time passes, the more expensive it gets, the harder it gets to keep average temperatures in a zone that will manage the risks. So it's true that losing time is very serious. It becomes more expensive and harder to do, and then requires deeper cuts. And deeper cuts of GHG emissions cost money. So over time, this becomes a greater challenge. The direction of things is to say, well, we can't tinker around anyway. It won't be enough to make, these sort of marginal steps. We need to have long-term, more ambitious plans. And you're seeing the Democratic candidates talk about more ambitious plans. You've seen people talk about the Green New Deal, for example. But that's just kind of one way of framing things. I think what you're going to see is ideas that go well beyond the Clean Power Plan, that go well beyond the fuel efficiency standards, but that build on them, because they're a start. But the question is, what can you accomplish if you think bigger and try to get to, the kind of 70-80% reduction by 2050? You really have to put in place an ambitious program. And if Congress were prepared to pass a law, you could imagine doing that with a variety of policy tools, like a carbon tax that some people are talking about. There are a lot of ways to do this. It's not like we lack the policy ideas. The problem is we lack the political will. And so what we're waiting for is to see if the presidential election will produce a mandate, both in terms of who gets elected president and what we see happening in Congress, that will turn the tide on this, and finally Congress will act.
While I have you, I want to zoom out a little bit, because we had you on a couple of years ago now for the first episode of this podcast, Trump on Earth. And at that time, a lot of people were wondering, geez, what's going to happen? In the last 2.5 years, or however long it's been, what have you seen happen? How effective has the Trump administration been at rolling back environmental protections in the U.S.?
Yeah. So when we first talked, when Trump came into office, many of us thought, well, he'll certainly weaken certain regulations, but we aren't sure he's actually going to withdraw the United States from the Paris Accord, for example, the international agreement on climate change. And there was a certain amount of optimism about, there would be certain constraints on how far it could go, et cetera. But it turns out that he's actually, I think, engaged in one of the most significant environmental rollbacks in U.S. history. I would say it's the most significant. And the reason I say that is that he did every single thing that we put on the worst case scenario list. Now, he hasn't accomplished all those things, but he certainly embarked on an effort to unravel every aspect of the Obama administration's climate action agenda. And the reason I think it's the most significant environmental rollback in history is because of the scope and the scale of the climate challenge, and also because of how many pieces of the puzzle the Obama administration had put in place. So, we had the most ambitious fuel efficiency standards in the history of the United States. We adopted those. We adopted the Clean Power Plan to deal with the electricity sector. That is a plan to deal with 2/3 of the greenhouse gas emissions in the U.S. economy and to put them on a glide path to getting lower and lower over time. And then, of course, the president signed a pledge to the Paris Accord of reducing our emissions between 26 and 28% by 2030. And all of that wound up together was the most that the U.S. government had ever done on climate change. And so what President Trump has done by announcing our withdrawal from Paris, and then by proposing, as he has done, he's proposed to freeze the fuel efficiency standards. So that's an unraveling of the Obama policy. And at the same time, when freezing them, the administration is to block California and other states from setting their own standards for cars and trucks. So that would be new and really radical. And then they come out and finalize this clean power replacement, which would do virtually nothing to reduce the emissions from the power sector. And you put all that together, and that's a pretty serious retrenchment. So to answer your question, he certainly announced about the maximum rollback you can announce. The question is, how much of this will wind up being accomplished? And that depends on what the courts do. And it also depends on the clock. And it depends on the next presidential election. So we are still going to have to wait and see.
Jody Freeman is director of the Harvard Law School Environmental and Energy Law Program. Thanks for listening to Trump on Earth. If you like our show, please consider supporting us through Patreon. Just go to patreon.com/TrumpOnEarth. You can find us online at TrumpOnEarth.org. This podcast is supported by the Robert F. Schuman Foundation. Our producer and digital editor is Andy Cubis. Kathy Nauer is the executive producer. My name's Reed Frazier. Thank you so much for listening. See you next time.